My name is Asher Corbin. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life I've worked in the quiet corners of the tech world, systems infrastructure, project servers, the invisible scaffolding that keeps a company's work from collapsing. If you've ever worked in an office, you probably know someone like me, the person who rarely interrupts meetings, the one who takes notes when nobody else volunteers, the one people assume is listening, but not necessarily important. That's usually how people saw me. Not unfriendly, not incompetent, just background. The dependable one, the calm one, the one who would fix something quietly after everyone else had already moved on. I live in Portland, Oregon, and at the time of this story, I was working for a mid-sized software firm that built logistics platforms for supply companies. Nothing glamorous, mostly back-end infrastructure and internal tools, the kind of work that only becomes visible when it stops working. And I suppose that's part of why people underestimated me. When your work prevents problems instead of creating excitement, people forget you're there at all. But this story isn't about revenge, and it's not about exposing villains. It's about something subtler than that. It's about what happens when people slowly decide what role you play in their world, and you quietly realize they've been wrong the entire time. Because at my company, there was a project server that almost everyone relied on. Designers uploaded assets there. Developers stored builds there. Managers reviewed timelines and documentation through it. And one morning, without warning, my coworker changed the password to the project server without telling anyone. At first, it seemed like a small oversight, the kind of thing people joke about in Slack. But then the morning got stranger. People began realizing they couldn't log in. Deadlines were approaching. Files couldn't be accessed. Teams started messaging each other in confusion. And soon enough, the question that quietly reshaped everything began circulating through management. When the entire team lost access during a critical deadline, management quickly started asking who had administrator privileges. That was the moment when something shifted. Not outwardly, not dramatically, just internally. Because the truth was, I knew exactly what had happened, and more importantly, I understood something the rest of the room didn't yet see. For years, I had been the person who fixed problems quietly after they appeared. But on that particular day, I realized something else. Sometimes the most powerful position in a room is the one no one remembers giving you. So this story isn't about anger. It's about observation, about patience, about the strange moment when being overlooked stops being a disadvantage and starts becoming a form of leverage. And I'm going to tell it honestly. No exaggeration, no dramatic revenge arcs, just the way it actually unfolded. But before I explain what happened that morning, there's something important you need to understand first. You need to understand who I was to them. Because that part of the story explains why nobody noticed what was happening until it was already too late. So let me ask you something before we continue. Have you ever been in a room where everyone assumed they understood your role, even though they never really asked? If you had asked anyone in my office who I was, the answers would have been remarkably consistent. Asher? Oh yeah, he handles the server stuff. Or sometimes, he's the quiet guy who fixes things. Well, that was usually the extent of it. Not wrong exactly, but not complete either. Our company had about 80 employees, spread across 3 main teams: development, design, and operations. Most of the personalities that stood out belonged to people in those departments. The developers debated architecture loudly in meetings. The designers defended color palettes with near philosophical intensity. Operations people talked constantly about timelines and deliverables. Those conversations shaped the culture of the company. My role, by contrast, rarely appeared in those conversations unless something broke. Which meant that when everything worked smoothly, and it usually did, my presence was easy to forget. I wasn't technically part of the development team, even though I supported them. I wasn't part of operations, even though their schedules depended on the infrastructure I maintained. And I definitely wasn't part of management. I sat somewhere in the quiet space between all of those groups. An internal systems specialist. A title that sounded more official than it actually felt day to day. Most of my mornings began the same way. I'd arrive early, usually around 7:30, long before the office filled with noise. I liked that hour of quiet. The servers hummed softly, the overhead lights were still dimmed, and Slack notifications hadn't started piling up yet. That's when I would check logs, backup confirmations, permission changes, storage thresholds, tiny signals most people never saw. In my notebook, the same black notebook I carried everywhere, I would jot down small observations. Archive node nearing capacity. User permission inheritance behaving strangely. Project server sync delay, 11 seconds longer than usual. They weren't dramatic discoveries, but systems fail in small ways long before they fail in big ones. And noticing the small things early was my job. Most people in the company didn't realize how many quiet corrections happened before problems ever reached them. Permissions adjusted, scripts patched, processes restarted. None of those fixes were visible to the people who benefited from them. And that invisibility slowly shaped how people treated me. Not unkindly, just casually. In meetings, my suggestions were often acknowledged with polite nods, then overshadowed by louder voices seconds later. When deadlines were discussed, infrastructure was usually assumed to just work. And when someone needed access to something urgently, I'd get a quick Slack message that began with the same phrase almost every time. "Hey Asher, quick favor." The thing is, I never really resented that dynamic. Not at first. Because from my perspective, the system was working. The company was stable. People trusted that things would run smoothly, and part of me took quiet pride in that. Still, there was something interesting about the way people unconsciously categorized roles. Developers were seen as the builders. Managers were decision-makers. Designers were creative voices. And people like me? We were support, reliable, helpful, replaceable, or at least that's what most people assumed. There was one moment that captured that dynamic perfectly. It happened during a quarterly planning meeting about 6 months before the incident with the project server. Everyone had gathered in the large conference room. Product leads were discussing upcoming releases, timelines, and dependencies. At one point, someone mentioned migrating several core tools to a new internal environment. The room buzzed with excitement about the possibilities. Faster deployment, better collaboration, cleaner workflow. After listening quietly for about 10 minutes, I spoke up. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. "I think the current project server structure might not handle that migration without permission conflicts," I said. "We'd probably need to restructure the access hierarchy first." There was a brief pause. One of the senior developers nodded. "Yeah, good point," he said. Then the conversation moved on. New features, marketing strategy, release timelines. No one asked about the permission hierarchy. No one asked how complicated that restructuring might actually be. The meeting ended with everyone energized about the plan. And later that afternoon, I quietly began reviewing the server architecture to see what adjustments might eventually be needed. That was the pattern. Ideas sparked in bright rooms full of voices. Then later, someone like me would quietly make sure reality didn't break them. And over time, that pattern shaped how people saw me. Competent, helpful, background, which is why, on the morning when the project server password suddenly changed, something important happened. Because the moment confusion started spreading across the office, people didn't immediately look at me. They looked everywhere else first. And that told me something about the role they believed I played. But the story didn't really begin with the password change. It started earlier, with something much smaller, something most people would have forgotten within minutes. But I didn't. In most workplaces, disrespect doesn't arrive dramatically. It doesn't come with raised voices or obvious hostility. More often, it arrives quietly. So quietly that if you tried to explain it to someone later, they might say you were overthinking it. The first small cut in this story looked exactly like that. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, about 4 months before the project server incident. Our development team had just finished a sprint review meeting. The room was still half full, laptops open, people lingering in small conversations before heading back to their desks. That's when Daniel Reeves walked in. Daniel had joined the company only a few weeks earlier as a technical project coordinator. He was around 30, confident in the way people often are when they arrive somewhere new and want to establish themselves quickly. He spoke easily in meetings. He asked questions with a kind of friendly authority. And people seemed to respond well to that energy, at least at first. I didn't know him very well yet. Our roles overlapped occasionally because project coordination often involved managing shared tools, timelines, documentation systems, and sometimes access permissions for internal platforms. which meant he had started interacting with the infrastructure team, meaning me. That afternoon, he was looking for someone. "Hey," he said to the room, glancing around. "Who manages the project server access?" A few people pointed toward me. "Asher does," someone said casually. Daniel turned, spotted me near the end of the table, and walked over. "Perfect," he said, smiling. "Quick thing." That phrase again. Quick thing. I closed my laptop halfway and gave him my attention. "What's up?" "We're reorganizing the design folders for the new logistics dashboard," he explained. "I'll probably need administrator access to the project server so I can adjust permissions and move some things around." The request itself wasn't unusual, but administrator privileges were. Most employees had standard access levels. Admin privileges allowed someone to change structural permissions across the server, who could see which folders, who could modify or delete files, things like that. Normally, those privileges were limited to infrastructure staff, or granted temporarily for specific tasks. So I nodded and asked the question I usually asked. "What kind of changes are you planning to make?" He waved his hand slightly, like the details weren't very important. "Oh, nothing complicated," he said. "Just reorganizing some directories so the design and dev teams stop tripping over each other." That sounded reasonable, but experience had taught me something important about system permissions. Small changes could ripple in unexpected ways, so I asked another question. "Do you know which folders you'll need to adjust?" "I can probably set more targeted permissions instead of full admin access." Daniel paused. Not long, just long enough for the tone of the interaction to shift a little. Then he smiled again, but this time there was a faint impatience underneath it. "I mean, it's probably easier if I just handle it," he said. A few people nearby were still packing up their things. The conversation wasn't private anymore. "It'll save you time too," he added. The implication was subtle. He wasn't asking for guidance. He was asking for control. I kept my voice calm. "I can set it up either way," I said. "I just want to make sure the permission tree stays stable. The server structure is a little older than it looks." Another small pause. Then he gave a short laugh. "Man, it's just a folder system," he said. Not aggressively, not loudly, just casually. But something about the phrasing caught the attention of a couple of people nearby. One of the designers chuckled. "Yeah, let him do it, Asher," she said. "Worst case, we'll blame Daniel if everything explodes." The room laughed lightly. It was the kind of harmless moment that passes through offices every day. I smiled too. Not because the comment bothered me. But moments like that reveal something about group dynamics. In that instant, the room had quietly decided something. Daniel was the person taking the initiative. I was the person being cautious. Background, helpful. A little overly technical, maybe, so I nodded. "All right," I said. "I can grant temporary admin access if that helps." Daniel looked satisfied. "Perfect." I made the change that afternoon. Temporary administrator privileges, limited to 72 hours, and I wrote a small note about it in my black notebook, not because I distrusted him, but because documenting permission changes was part of how I worked. Most people forget small moments like that within minutes. The conversation ended. Everyone went back to their desks. The folders were reorganized later that week. No immediate problems appeared. And if you asked anyone in the office about it afterward, they probably wouldn't have remembered the exchange at all. But I did. Not because the comment about just a folder system hurt my feelings. It didn't. What stayed with me was something subtler. The way the room had responded. The way people instinctively sided with the person who sounded confident, rather than the person who understood the system. It wasn't malicious, just human. Still, I wrote one more line in the notebook that evening before I left the office. Daniel prefers control over consultation. At the time, it was just an observation, nothing more. But later, when the project server password suddenly changed without warning, that small moment became more important than anyone realized. The strange thing about small moments of dismissal is that they rarely stay isolated. They repeat, not dramatically, not in ways that make people uncomfortable enough to intervene. Just often enough that a pattern quietly forms. After the folder permission incident, my interactions with Daniel became more frequent. As a project coordinator, he naturally dealt with shared systems, deadlines, and cross-team communication. All of those things touched the infrastructure I maintained. At first, everything felt normal. He would message me on Slack. "Hey Asher, quick question." Or, "Can you adjust access for the design sprint folder?" Routine things. But the tone gradually shifted in small ways. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk while I was reviewing backup logs. "Hey," he said, leaning slightly on the edge of the divider. "I think we should simplify how the project server is structured." I turned my chair toward him. "In what way?" "There are too many nested folders," he said. "It's confusing for people." That wasn't entirely wrong. The server had evolved over several years, and while it was functional, it wasn't always elegant. But I also knew something he didn't yet understand. The structure existed for a reason: access inheritance, security boundaries, version control separation. Still, I kept my explanation simple. Some of those layers are tied to permission inheritance, I said. If we flatten everything too much, it might create conflicts between teams. He nodded, but the nod felt performative. "Yeah, I get that," he said. Then he added, "But honestly, people just need something intuitive." Again, the implication was subtle. Infrastructure complexity versus user simplicity. Both valid concerns. But the conversation didn't really become a collaboration. It became a decision he had already made. "I'll draft a new structure," he continued, "and we can implement it next sprint." I noticed the phrasing. Not discuss, not explore, implement. I didn't argue. Instead, I said something I had started saying more often. "Let me know when you've mapped it out." He smiled. "Will do." And then he walked away. That might sound insignificant, but what I noticed over the next few weeks was how those conversations began happening in front of other people. In stand-ups, in quick hallway discussions, in Slack threads where multiple teams were watching. Daniel would propose something about how systems should work. And when I raised a technical consideration, the room often reacted the same way. A quick acknowledgement. Then the momentum moved forward without really engaging with the concern. Not hostile, just dismissive. Once, during a sprint planning session, he said something that made the room laugh again. We were discussing file version conflicts between the design and development teams. I mentioned that adjusting the permission structure might prevent accidental overwrites. Daniel leaned back in his chair and said with a grin, "Or we could just teach people not to overwrite files." The room chuckled. Someone added, "That might be harder than fixing the server." Daniel laughed. "True. But let's not over-engineer this, right?" Again, the moment passed quickly, but moments like that slowly do something interesting to group perception. They shape a narrative. Daniel became the voice of efficiency. I became the voice of caution. And once that narrative settles in a workplace, people begin reacting to the narrative, not the individuals. I noticed it most clearly during meetings. When Daniel spoke, people leaned in. When I spoke, they listened politely, but they were already waiting for the next louder voice. To be clear, none of this felt malicious. No one insulted me. No one excluded me. In fact, people often thanked me for fixing things. "Appreciate it, Asher. Thanks for handling that." But appreciation and influence are not the same thing. Over time, something subtle happened inside my own thinking too. I started rationalizing the pattern. He's new. He's trying to prove himself. People like confident voices. The systems still work. That's what matters. And most importantly, conflict wouldn't help anything. So I stayed consistent. I documented changes. I adjusted permissions when requested. I quietly corrected small structural issues before they grew into bigger ones. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, I was becoming more aware of something. The role people had assigned to me. Reliable, helpful, technical, invisible. And the more consistent I remained in that role, the more comfortable everyone else became expecting it. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a confrontation. It arrives as repetition. By the time you notice the pattern clearly, everyone else already believes it's normal. Which is why, when something finally disrupted that pattern months later, the reaction across the office felt so confused. Because people had grown used to a world where the infrastructure simply worked, and where someone like me quietly made sure it stayed that way. But before that disruption happened, there was another realization I had to face first. Not about Daniel, not about the team, about myself, about the role I had slowly accepted. There's a moment in most long-running workplace dynamics when something quietly becomes clear. Not because anyone says it out loud, but because you begin seeing the pattern from the outside instead of from within it. For me, that moment happened on a Thursday afternoon during a release planning meeting. Nothing dramatic happened in the room, no arguments, no confrontations, just a small shift in perspective. The meeting itself was typical. Our teams were preparing for a major client update, new logistics tracking features, expanded reporting dashboards, and several back-end changes that required coordination between development and operations. Daniel was leading most of the discussion. He stood near the whiteboard, outlining timelines while different teams added notes and concerns. "Design will finalize assets by Tuesday," he said, writing quickly. "Dev integration by Thursday. QA begins Friday." It was efficient, organized. Exactly the kind of structure project managers like to see. About halfway through the meeting, someone from the development team raised a concern. "What about server deployment? Are we pushing everything to the project server before staging?" Daniel paused and looked around the room. Then he glanced briefly at me. "Asher can handle that part," he said casually. The sentence landed softly, but it carried a certain finality. The room nodded. "Of course, Asher can handle that. That's what Asher does. Fix the infrastructure. Make sure the system supports whatever plan has already been decided." No one asked what server adjustments might actually be required. No one asked whether the new workflow might create permission conflicts or storage bottlenecks. The assumption was simple. If a technical complication existed, I would quietly solve it. I didn't object. I simply said, "I'll review the deployment structure after the meeting." Daniel nodded once and continued writing on the board. The conversation moved on. Marketing timelines, client presentations, feature priorities. But something about that moment lingered with me. Not the assignment itself. That part made sense. What stayed with me was the speed of the room's agreement. No hesitation, no curiosity, just collective confidence that the server stuff would take care of itself. After the meeting ended, people filed out in small groups. I stayed behind for a minute to gather my notebook and laptop. Daniel approached as I was closing the notebook. "Hey," he said. "Thanks for always handling the infrastructure side of things." I looked up. His tone sounded sincere. "I appreciate how reliable you are," he added. Reliable. That word again. It wasn't an insult. In fact, it was probably meant as a compliment. But reliability, in many workplaces, comes with a strange side effect. When someone is consistently reliable, people stop thinking about the work required to maintain that reliability. They stop asking questions. They stop involving that person in earlier decisions. Instead, they assume the reliable person will adapt to whatever plan emerges, quietly, without friction. I nodded. "No problem," I said. He smiled and headed toward the door. As I walked back to my desk afterward, I thought about something I'd heard a mentor say years earlier during my first infrastructure job. "Systems people don't just maintain technology," he had told me. "We maintain assumptions." At the time, I hadn't fully understood what he meant, but standing there in the quiet hallway, I started to see it more clearly. The system inside our company wasn't just technical, it was social. Daniel's role, organizer, decision driver. The developer's role, builders. Management's role, direction setters. And my role, the quiet stabilizer, the person who ensured reality didn't interrupt momentum. Again, none of that was inherently unfair. Every organization assigns roles, formally or informally. But the realization that struck me that afternoon was this. Roles become limiting when they stop being questioned. And in our office, my role had become something almost invisible. Reliable, technical, background. I sat down at my desk and opened the black notebook again. Under that day's notes about deployment planning, I wrote a simple observation. People trust the system without understanding it. Then after a few seconds, I added another line. They trust me the same way. It wasn't resentment, just clarity. Because when people trust something without thinking about it, they also stop noticing when it changes. And that realization stayed quietly in my mind for the next few weeks. Until the morning when the project server password changed. Until the moment when people suddenly couldn't access the files they depended on. Until the room that once assumed everything would simply work began looking for answers. But before that moment arrived, something else happened. Something small. Something internal. A shift that had nothing to do with Daniel or anyone else. It happened on a quiet morning in the office. Long before anyone realized a problem was coming. And that moment changed how I approached everything that followed. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There wasn't a confrontation or a moment where someone crossed a clear line. In fact, if you had walked past my desk that morning, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything different at all. It was a Wednesday. The office was still quiet when I arrived, the same way it usually was when I came in early. The overhead lights were dim, and the low hum of the server racks in the adjacent room filled the space with that steady, mechanical calm I had grown used to over the years. I set my bag down, opened my laptop, and began the same routine I followed every morning. Check system logs, review overnight backups, confirm synchronization between the project server and the archive nodes. Nothing unusual appeared at first, just the normal stream of technical information most people would find unreadable. Lines of timestamps, status codes, routine confirmations. But as I moved through the logs, I noticed something small. A cluster of permission queries from the previous evening. No changes, just repeated checks. Someone had been exploring the project server's access structure. I leaned back slightly in my chair and scrolled through the entries more carefully. The activity wasn't malicious. It wasn't even disruptive. Just someone navigating deeper levels of the server's administrative panels, trying to understand how permissions cascaded through the folder hierarchy. It took about 30 seconds to identify the user, Daniel. Again, there was nothing inherently wrong with that. His temporary admin access had been granted weeks earlier, and while it had technically expired, he had asked once or twice for extensions when reorganizing directories. That kind of thing happened. Still, the pattern caught my attention, not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded me of something. Daniel liked control. He preferred adjusting systems directly rather than asking questions about them. That realization wasn't new, but something about seeing it reflected quietly in the logs made the idea settle differently in my mind. For a few minutes, I just watched the lines of activity, not judging, just observing. And that's when something subtle shifted in my thinking. For months, I had been reacting to the system around me. Requests came in. I fulfilled them. Problems appeared. I fixed them. Suggestions were dismissed. I accepted that and continued doing the work anyway. It was a reactive position. Reliable. Predictable. But that morning, I realized something important. Reacting and observing are not the same thing. When you react, you follow the momentum of other people's decisions. When you observe, you begin to see the structure behind those decisions. And the structure around me had become very clear. Daniel was becoming increasingly involved in system-level adjustments. Management trusted him because he appeared proactive. The teams assumed the infrastructure was simple enough that anyone organized could manage it. And my role had slowly shifted into something even quieter than before. Not the person shaping the system. The person quietly maintained it after others had already reshaped it. Again, that wasn't necessarily a problem, but it was a dynamic worth understanding. I closed the log viewer and sat there for a moment, thinking about something my mentor had once told me. Control over a system isn't always about authority. Sometimes it's about understanding. Authority can be granted quickly. Understanding takes time, and infrastructure systems, especially ones that had grown organically over several years, contained layers of complexity that weren't obvious to casual users. That morning, I realized I had been underestimating something. Not Daniel, not the team, my own position. Because while people might assume the project server was just a folder system, the reality was much more intricate. Permission inheritance, backup relationships, synchronization between internal and external environments, security rules are tied to older legacy structures. All of it is interconnected, and I understood all of it. Not because I was smarter than anyone else, simply because I had been the one maintaining it quietly for years. That realization didn't make me feel defensive. If anything, it made me feel calm. Clarity has that effect. When you understand the structure of a system, you stop feeling the need to argue about it. You just watch it more carefully. So that morning, I opened my notebook again and wrote a new heading across the top of the page. Project Server Architecture, Full Map. Then I started documenting it more thoroughly than I ever had before. Folder inheritance layers, administrative overrides, hidden dependencies that weren't obvious unless you knew where to look. Not because I expected a problem, but because understanding a system completely is never a wasted effort. The interesting part is this. At the time, I had no idea that only a few weeks later, the entire office would suddenly lose access to that same server, and management would start asking a question that changed the tone of everything. Who has administrator privileges? But by then, my mindset had already changed. Silence wasn't just my default anymore. It had become a choice. And choices, when made quietly, can alter the course of a situation long before anyone notices. After that Wednesday morning, something subtle changed in how I moved through the office. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still arrived early. I still checked the logs. I still responded to Slack messages that began with, "Hey Asher, quick favor." But internally, I had shifted from reacting to observing. And that difference, while invisible to everyone else, changed the way I interpreted small moments throughout the day. For example, a week later, during a team stand-up, Daniel mentioned that he had cleaned up a few things on the project server. The comment came casually, almost as an aside. "Moved some folders around last night," he said. "Just simplifying the structure a bit." Several people nodded approvingly. "Nice," someone said. "Yeah, that thing was getting messy." No one looked at me when he said it, which made sense. After all, the narrative around the office had already been established. Daniel, proactive, efficient. Willing to jump in and organize things. Me, the quiet systems person who made sure the server stayed running. So when someone spoke confidently about reorganizing the server, people assumed it was simply progress, not a risk. I could have interrupted. I could have explained that changing directory structures without mapping permission inheritance could break access paths later. But I didn't. Not because I was frustrated, and not because I wanted something to fail. I stayed quiet because something else had become clear. The room didn't actually want a technical explanation at that moment. They wanted reassurance that things were moving forward. And arguing against momentum rarely changes the direction of a conversation. Instead, it just changes how people perceive you. So I made a decision that morning. Silence would no longer be automatic, but it would still be present. Only now, it would be intentional. Over the next couple of weeks, I began paying closer attention to the changes happening around the project server. Not interfering, just observing. Daniel requested admin extensions twice more, each time with a quick Slack message. Need to tweak some folder permissions. Adjusting structure again for the new sprint. Both requests were approved, not just by me, but by management, who appreciated initiative. And to be fair, nothing catastrophic happened. Files were still accessible. Teams continued working. Deadlines moved forward. On the surface, everything appeared stable. But behind that surface, I noticed small shifts. Permissions that had been carefully inherited were now manually overridden. Some directories had been moved outside their original access groups. A few security layers that once separated internal and external resources have been flattened. Again, none of these changes caused immediate problems. Infrastructure rarely fails instantly. It accumulates instability quietly. One afternoon, while reviewing the updated structure, I noticed a particularly interesting adjustment. The root-level project server password had been accessed through the admin console. Not changed, just accessed. I checked the log details. Daniel again. Still not alarming. Anyone with administrator privileges could technically view the root authentication panel, but the action told me something about his approach. He wasn't just reorganizing folders anymore. He was exploring deeper parts of the system, learning how much control the admin panel actually provides. I closed the log window and leaned back in my chair. This was the kind of moment where many people would step in immediately, send a message, schedule a meeting, reassert authority over the system. But that wasn't what I did. Instead, I asked myself a quieter question. What happens when someone explores a complex system they only partially understand? The answer isn't sabotage, and it isn't necessarily incompetence. It's curiosity combined with confidence. Sometimes that combination leads to innovation. Sometimes it leads to unintended consequences. Either way, the situation had become interesting enough that I wanted to understand how it would develop. So I kept watching, not passively, carefully. I documented the permission changes, the directory movements, the admin console visits. All of it went into the notebook. Not because I expected to use it, but because documenting systems is simply how I think. And during that time, the office dynamic continued exactly as before. Meetings, deadlines, Coffee conversations. Daniel remained the energetic organizer whom people appreciated. I remained the quiet infrastructure presence people relied on when something technical needed fixing. Nothing felt tense, nothing felt confrontational, which is why, when the real problem finally appeared, the confusion across the office spread so quickly. Because from everyone else's perspective, the system had always been simple, just folders, just files, just a shared server. But the reality was more complicated. And by the time that reality revealed itself, the changes that caused it had already been happening quietly for weeks. Changes that almost no one had noticed. Almost. One of the interesting things about working with systems, technical or human, is that most people only see what happens on the surface. They see the interface, the buttons, the folders. But the deeper structure, the logic that connects everything together, usually stays invisible. And that invisibility creates a kind of illusion, an illusion that things are simpler than they actually are. Over the weeks after Daniel began adjusting the project server structure, that illusion stayed firmly in place across the office. Designers continued uploading assets. Developers continued pulling builds. Operations tracked deadlines through shared documents. Everything appeared normal. But beneath that surface, I had begun mapping something more carefully than I ever had before. The full architecture of the project server, not just the visible folders, the permission inheritance chains, the backup relationships, the synchronization bridges between our internal system and the remote archive server used for long-term storage. All of it. Every layer. Most people would have asked why. Why spend hours mapping a system that was already working? But the answer was simple. Because systems rarely break where people expect them to. They break where no one is looking. Each morning, before the office filled with noise, I would open the admin panel and review the previous day's activity. Permission adjustments, directory relocations, admin console visits. Most of those actions came from Daniel's account. Not constantly. Just enough to show that he was still experimenting with the system. Trying to make it more intuitive, as he liked to say. And again, none of his changes were reckless. They were logical from a surface perspective. Flattening folder structures, moving shared resources into more visible locations, removing layers that looked unnecessary. If someone unfamiliar with the server's deeper logic reviewed those changes, they might even say they were improvements. Cleaner, simpler, more direct. But infrastructure often contains layers that look redundant until you understand why they exist. Permission inheritance, for example, can cascade through multiple directories in ways that aren't obvious. Moving one folder can change who has access to another. Flattening a structure can accidentally merge access groups that were meant to stay separate. And when those changes accumulate slowly, the system becomes something new without anyone realizing it. That's what I was watching happen, not a disaster, a transformation. Daniel thought he was reorganizing a filing cabinet. In reality, he was gradually reshaping a permission ecosystem. One afternoon, I noticed a particularly interesting side effect. Two teams that previously had separate access scopes were now inheriting permissions from the same parent directory. Meaning that, technically speaking, either team could modify files that once belonged exclusively to the other. No one had noticed yet, probably because no one had attempted to modify those files. But the potential was there. I wrote the observation in my notebook. Then I kept mapping. By that point, the architecture diagram I was building had grown into several pages. Arrows connecting directories, notes about inheritance rules. Backup dependencies are marked in small boxes near the margins. It wasn't something I planned to show anyone. It was simply a way to understand the system completely. Because once you understand something completely, you stop worrying about it, even if other people misunderstand it. Around that time, another small moment happened in the office that almost made me smile. During a sprint review, someone commented that the project server felt way easier to navigate lately. Daniel grinned. "Glad it's helping," he said. A few people nodded. "Yeah, it's cleaner now." "Nice work." I didn't say anything, not because they were wrong. From their perspective, the system probably did feel cleaner, but what they were experiencing wasn't simplicity. It was the early stage of structural drift, the kind that remains invisible until something interacts with it in an unexpected way. And that's the part no one ever anticipates. Systems don't collapse because someone makes one bad decision. They collapse because dozens of small, reasonable decisions slowly reshape the environment. Until one day, A single action triggers the consequences of all those earlier changes. At that point, the reaction is always the same. Confusion first, then urgency, then a search for someone who understands what just happened. By the time I finished mapping the final layer of the server architecture, I realized something interesting. There were now multiple points in the system where a single administrative action could cause widespread access problems. Not intentionally, just structurally. That realization didn't alarm me. If anything, it gave me clarity. Because understanding a system's weak points means you also understand how to stabilize it when necessary. And the strange part is this: only a few days after I finished mapping that structure, someone performed exactly the kind of administrative action that could trigger those weak points. A single change, quiet, almost routine, the kind of change most people wouldn't think twice about. But that morning, when employees across the office opened their laptops, the project server suddenly asked them for a password they didn't have, and the entire company realized something was very wrong. The morning the project server locked everyone out started like any other. I arrived at the office around 7:30, set my bag down, and powered on my laptop. The building was still quiet, the kind of quiet that exists before Slack notifications start stacking up and people begin discussing deadlines over coffee. For the first 15 minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Backup logs looked normal. Archive synchronization had completed overnight. Storage capacity remained stable. Then I opened the project server access panel, and that's where the first anomaly appeared. The system was prompting for a root authentication password, something that almost never happened for regular users. Normally, employees logged in through their company credentials, which inherited access permissions through the directory structure. But now the root gate had been triggered, which meant something deeper had changed. I entered my administrator credentials and accessed the logs. Within seconds, the timeline became clear. At 6:12 a.m., an administrative login had been recorded. The account name was familiar: Daniel. At 6:14 a.m., the root server password had been changed. 2 minutes later, several directory-level permissions attempted to refresh. And that's where the cascading effect began. Because the permission inheritance structure had already been reshaped over the previous weeks, the new root authentication requirement disrupted the way those permissions propagated through the system. Some directories attempted to verify credentials that no longer matched their parent structure. Others locked themselves automatically to prevent unauthorized access. By the time the system finished reconciling the changes, the result was simple. Almost no one could access the project server anymore. From a technical perspective, it wasn't catastrophic. The files still existed. The backups were intact. But the authentication bridge connecting employees to those files had fractured, which meant the system was effectively sealed. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The office was still quiet. No one had noticed yet, but they would. Within the next hour, people would begin opening their laptops. Someone would try to pull a design file. Someone else would attempt to upload a build, and then the messages would start. Can anyone access the project server? Is the login down? I'm getting a password prompt. From there, the confusion would spread quickly, because the timing was particularly unfortunate. That week contained one of the company's most critical client deadlines. Several teams depended on the files stored on that server, which meant management would soon be asking questions. And the first question would be predictable. Who changed the password? But before any of that happened, I did something simple. I checked one more log entry. Daniel's login session. It had lasted only 5 minutes. No other changes had been recorded afterward, which told me something important. He had likely believed the password change was routine. Maybe he thought it would clean up access control. Maybe he assumed everyone would simply log in again through the updated authentication gateway. In a system without complex inheritance layers, that assumption might have been harmless. But in our system, the one that had slowly drifted structurally over several weeks, the change interacted with dozens of underlying permission paths. Paths Daniel didn't know existed. I closed the log viewer and sat quietly for a moment. This was the part of the story where some people expect a feeling of satisfaction, a sense of vindication. But honestly, that's not what I felt. What I felt was clarity. Because everything that had happened over the past few months suddenly made sense in a single moment. The dismissals, the confidence, the incremental changes. All of it had led to a point where someone with partial understanding had just triggered the deeper mechanics of a system they believed was simple, and the consequences were now unfolding. Still, there was another realization forming in my mind, a quieter one, because while the system was currently locked, I also knew something no one else in the office did yet. The backups were untouched. The permission map I had documented over the past weeks showed exactly where the inheritance paths had fractured, and restoring stability wouldn't actually be very difficult, not for someone who understood the architecture completely. But the office didn't know any of that yet. Right now, they were still in the calm before the storm. Soon, someone would try to log in, then someone else, and eventually, the entire team would realize they were locked out during one of the most critical weeks of the quarter. When that happened, management would begin asking a different question. Not just who changed the password, but who actually understood the server well enough to fix it. And that was the moment when the dynamic inside the company would quietly begin to shift. At 8:17 a.m., the first Slack message appeared. It came from one of the designers on the logistics dashboard team. "Hey, is the project server down for anyone else?" I watched the message appear on my screen while I was finishing a cup of coffee. 30 seconds later, another message appeared. "I'm getting a password prompt." Then a third. "Same here." Within 2 minutes, the channel filled with short, uncertain replies. "Can't log in either. Did credentials change? Is this maintenance?" The tone was still calm. At this stage, people usually assume a system hiccup, something temporary, something that will resolve itself in a few minutes. But I already knew it wouldn't, because the authentication chain wasn't temporarily unavailable. It had been structurally interrupted. At 8:23, someone tried something else. "Does anyone know the new password?" That message triggered a wave of reaction emojis, confused faces, question marks. And then the conversation shifted toward the one person most people associated with recent server adjustments. Daniel. Daniel, did you update something this morning?" A minute passed before he responded. I did reset the root password earlier." The channel went quiet for a moment. Then another message appeared. "Do we have it?" Daniel replied again. "I set a new one." "Yeah, should still work." But the next few responses arrived quickly. "Nope. Still locked out. Same issue." Now the tone began changing. Don't panic yet. But urgency. Because more people were arriving at work. More people were trying to access the server. And the same login prompt appeared for everyone. By 8:40, the engineering lead joined the thread. "What's going on?" Several people summarized the situation quickly. "The server is asking for a password. No one is able to access files." Daniel reset root credentials earlier. The lead replied almost immediately. "Why was the root password changed?" Daniel responded with a short explanation. "Trying to clean up admin access and standardize the authentication layer." That explanation might have sounded reasonable if the system was simple, but now dozens of people were staring at login prompts that prevented them from accessing their work. And the client deadline that week was starting to loom over everyone's mind. At 8:52, the message everyone expected finally appeared. Management had entered the conversation. "Who currently has administrator privileges on the project server?" The Slack channel went quiet again. Because while many people used the system, very few understood who actually controlled it. Daniel answered first, "I do." Then someone added, "Asher does too." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a direct message appeared in my inbox from the engineering lead. "Hey Asher, can you take a look at the server issue?" I stared at the message for a moment, not because I was unsure how to respond, but because this was the exact moment where the path forward mattered. Technically speaking, I could resolve the lockout fairly quickly. The architecture map I had built showed exactly where the authentication break had occurred. I could reconstruct the inheritance chain, reassign the correct permissions, restore access. But the decision in front of me wasn't about technical difficulty, it was about timing. Because right now, something important was happening inside the company. For the first time, people were realizing the system wasn't simple. For the first time, the infrastructure wasn't invisible. For the first time, the room was asking a question they had never really considered before. Who actually understands how this works? Fixing the issue immediately would solve the problem, but it would also erase the moment of clarity unfolding around it. So I typed a careful response to the engineering lead, looking into the logs now. Technically true, I had already reviewed them, but the phrasing gave space for something else to happen. Understanding. Within the Slack channel, more questions were beginning to circulate. How does the password reset affect our access? Why would it lock the folders? Can we revert it? Daniel replied to several of them, trying to explain what he thought had happened, but the answers sounded uncertain, because the structure of the system was more complicated than he had realized. And for the first time, the room could hear that uncertainty. I watched the conversation unfold quietly, not interfering, just observing. Because moments like this are rare in organizations. Moments when a hidden system suddenly becomes visible. Moments when assumptions begin to shift. Eventually, the engineering lead sent another message. Can you jump into a quick call, Asher? I closed my notebook slowly. The decision had already been made. Not about whether I would fix the server. Of course I would. The decision was about something else. How the situation would unfold before that fix happened. Because once the system came back online, the office would return to normal. But right now, for the first time in months, everyone was paying attention to the infrastructure they had assumed was simple. And sometimes, clarity requires a little time. I didn't confront anyone. There was no reason to. Instead, I did what I had always done. I documented everything. The server logs clearly showed when the password had been changed. The access permissions showed who had administrator privileges. And the backup schedule confirmed that I had followed the correct procedures the entire time. I quietly prepared a short report. Nothing emotional, just facts. When management asked what had happened during the outage, I shared the documentation calmly. No accusations, just information. At that moment, something became clear to everyone in the room. The problem hadn't been the system. It had been the decision to change something critical without telling the rest of the team. And that realization didn't require me to say a single extra word. Over the next few days, small changes started happening. Management reviewed access privileges across the entire project. Administrator rights were no longer limited to just one person. New rules were introduced for password changes and system access. Everything had to be documented. Everything had to be shared. People in the office started asking more questions about the infrastructure, questions they had never asked before. For the first time, many of them realized how much of the project depended on systems that usually ran quietly in the background, and slowly, my role in maintaining those systems became more visible. Not because I demanded recognition, but because the situation made it impossible to ignore. Eventually, my coworker approached me. He stood by my desk for a moment before speaking. I didn't realize the change would lock everyone out, he said. His tone wasn't defensive, just awkward. I nodded. It happens, I replied. What had already happened couldn't really be undone. The outage had already delayed the project. Management had already adjusted responsibilities. The system had already been changed. By the time people realized how important communication had been, the situation had already made the lesson clear. Some things you only understand after the damage is done. Later that evening, I thought about the entire situation again. There were many things I could have said during the crisis. I could have pointed fingers. I could have argued in meetings. I could have tried to prove someone wrong. But none of that would have solved the real problem. So I chose not to. Sometimes the most effective response isn't speaking louder. It's letting the facts stand on their own. And in this case, the facts had already said everything that needed to be said. After that week, the office felt slightly different. People started including me earlier in technical discussions. Managers asked for my input before making changes to the system, not because I asked for it, but because they now understood what I had been responsible for all along. I didn't change how I worked. I was still quiet, still focused on the details. The only difference was that now people paid attention. Sometimes respect doesn't arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through consistency. Looking back, the situation wasn't really about a password change. It was about something much simpler. Communication. In many workplaces, the quiet roles are the easiest to overlook. Until something stops working. Then suddenly, everyone wants to know who understands the system. That week reminded me of something important. You don't always need to defend your work loudly. If you do your job carefully, document your actions, and stay calm under pressure, the truth eventually becomes visible. And when it does, you don't need to argue. Your work speaks for you. So I'm curious. Have you ever been in a situation where people didn't realize the value of your work until something went wrong? I'd really like to hear your story.